In the brutal winter of 1879, deep in the silver mining camps of Colorado Territory near Leadville, a place where the mountains seemed to breathe cold, and the wind cut through wool like it was nothing, a man named Isaac Coleman was becoming the laughingstock of Harrison Gulch. The other miners, hardened men who had come from Pennsylvania coal country and Michigan copper mines, watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt as he constructed what they called his Fool's Dome. Isaac had arrived in Leadville the previous spring, a carpenter by trade from Ohio who had lost his wife to consumption and decided that starting fresh in the high country might give him a reason to keep breathing. He had worked claims with reasonable success, enough to buy himself a decent plot on the eastern edge of the gulch, about half a mile from where most of the other miners had built their cabins, close enough to hear the stamp mills working, when the wind was right but far enough to have some solitude. The area sat at an altitude where your lungs burned in the thin air, and where winter came early and stayed late, a place where men joked that there were 9 months of winter and 3 months of damn poor sledding. That first summer and fall, Isaac had watched carefully how the other miners built their shelters. Most followed the same pattern their fathers and grandfathers had used back east. Rectangular log cabins with steep roofs to shed snow, chinked with mud and moss, heated by stone fireplaces that consumed cord after cord of precious timber. He bunked with a fellow named Martin Hayes that first winter, a decent sort who had a cabin about a quarter mile up the gulch, and Isaac spent those long frozen months noticing things that bothered him. The cabins leaked heat, something fierce. Martin would wake 3 or 4 times a night to feed the fire, and even then the water bucket by the door would have ice on it come morning. The wind found every gap in the chinking, and when the real cold settled in, the kind that made your teeth ache just from breathing, those cabins became desperate places where you burned through your wood supply twice as fast as you planned, and still shivered under every blanket you owned. Isaac saw men with frostbitten fingers and toes, saw families huddled together for warmth, saw the desperation in their eyes when they realized their firewood wouldn't last until spring. But what really got Isaac thinking was a conversation he had in late February with an old Ute guide named Grey Wolf, who sometimes came through the camps trading furs. Grey Wolf told him about how his people had built winter shelters in the old days, dome-shaped structures partly dug into the earth that held warmth like nothing else. He described how the rounded shape shed wind and snow, how the earth itself provided insulation, how a small fire could keep the whole space comfortable. Isaac listened with the intensity of a man who had spent too many nights watching his breath cloud inside supposedly solid walls. When he tried to explain this to Martin and some of the other miners at the general store, they looked at him like he had lost his mind. A dome? Made of what? Dirt and sticks like some kind of Indian wickiup. This was 1879, not the Stone Age. They had proper lumber from the sawmills, proper building techniques passed down through generations of American craftsmanship. Martin Hayes actually laughed and said Isaac was welcome to freeze in his mud hut while real men lived in real cabins. But Isaac couldn't shake the idea. He had seen too much suffering that winter, had burned through too much of his own money, buying firewood at inflated prices from the timber merchants who came up from Denver. He had watched neighbors running out of fuel in January and February, seen the panic in their eyes. The following spring, when the snow finally melted enough to work, Isaac made his decision. He would build something different. The other miners thought he was a fool, but Isaac Coleman had spent his whole adult life working with wood and stone, and he trusted his hands and his observations more than he trusted tradition. He chose a spot on his property where the ground had good drainage but was still workable, marked out a circle about 18 feet across, and began to dig. That was in late April of 1879, and by the time he was done, more than 6 months later, he would have created something that would change how men thought about surviving in the high country. Isaac started by digging down into the earth about 3 feet, creating a circular pit that would become the floor of his shelter. The ground was still half frozen in places, but he worked it with a pickaxe and shovel, hauling out rock and soil in a wheelbarrow he had bought from a failed miner heading back east. His neighbours would ride past and shake their heads, and more than once someone asked him if he was digging his own grave. Isaac just smiled and kept working. He understood something they didn't, something Grey Wolf had helped him see. The earth below the frost line stayed at a relatively constant temperature, cool in summer and much warmer than the air in winter. By setting his floor below ground level, he was essentially wrapping his shelter in a blanket of earth that would moderate temperature swings. But try explaining that to men who thought anything that wasn't a rectangle with 4 walls and a peaked roof was primitive and backward. The next part required timber, but not nearly as much as a conventional cabin. Isaac rode up to the sawmill near Tennessee Pass, about a day's journey on horseback, and purchased lodgepole pine logs, choosing ones that were relatively straight, about thick as his forearm, and somewhere around 12 to 15 feet in length. He needed maybe 30 of them, plus shorter pieces for crossbeams. The mill operator, a fellow named Jenkins, who Isaac had played cards with a few times, asked what he was building. When Isaac explained, Jenkins just shook his head and said the altitude must be getting to him. But Isaac loaded his timber onto a rented wagon and hauled it back to Harrison Gulch, and by early June he was ready to start the actual construction. The technique Isaac used was something between carpentry and basket weaving on a massive scale. He set upright posts around the perimeter of his circular pit, sinking them deep into the ground and tamping them solid with rocks and soil. These posts would bear the weight of everything to come. Then he began bending and lashing the longer poles to create the dome frame, curving them from one side to the other, lashing them together at the apex with leather cord and wire he had purchased from the general store. It was back-breaking work, done mostly alone, because no one else believed in what he was doing enough to help. His hands grew calloused and rope burned. His back ached from lifting and positioning the heavy timbers. But slowly, the skeleton of the dome took shape. It looked strange rising from the earth, this rounded cage of wood, so different from the sharp angles and straight lines of the cabins that dotted the gulch. As the dome frame grew, the mockery intensified. Men would come by just to stare and make jokes. There was a miner named Dutch Hendricks who lived maybe half a mile south, and he brought friends to look at what he called Coleman's basket case. They laughed about how the first heavy snow would collapse it like an eggshell, how even if it didn't fall down, it would be an icebox come winter, how Isaac was wasting good timber and good money on something that Indians might have built 1,000 years ago, but that no sensible white man would live in. Martin Hayes, who had been friendly enough, started avoiding Isaac, embarrassed to be associated with such foolishness. Even the storekeep, a practical man named Wilson, who rarely expressed opinions on anything, suggested Isaac might want to build a proper cabin before winter set in, just in case his experiment didn't work out. Isaac heard them all and kept working. By mid-July, he had the dome frame complete and began the next phase, creating the layers that would make this shelter actually function. He gathered saplings and willow branches, weaving them between the main structural poles to create a tight lattice work. This took weeks of patient, repetitive labour. His hands raw from handling the rough wood, splinters embedded in his palms despite the gloves he wore. Once he had the latticework dense enough, he began applying the first layer of what would become the shelter's skin. He mixed clay soil with water and straw, creating an adobe-like plaster that he pressed into the latticework from both inside and outside, building it up hand-width by hand-width, until he had a layer thick as a man's arm covering the entire dome. The work was messy and slow, and every time he took a break to eat or sleep, he could feel the skepticism of his neighbours like weight on his shoulders. But Isaac had a plan beyond what anyone else could see. After the clay layer dried in the August sun, he applied a layer of sod, actual pieces of earth with grass still growing on it, which he cut from the meadow near his property. He overlapped these pieces like shingles on a roof, starting from the bottom and working his way up, so that water would run down and away rather than seeping in. The living grass would grow and interweave, creating a green roof that would shed rain and snow while providing another layer of insulation. Then came something truly unusual. He gathered river stones, smooth and rounded from the creek that ran through the gulch, and set them into more clay plaster on the lower third of the dome's exterior, creating a stone skirt that would protect the base from weather and provide thermal mass. The whole structure, when he finally stepped back to look at it in late September, appeared to be a hill that had grown out of the earth, green-topped and stone-sided, with a low doorway framed with timber on the southern exposure. Inside, Isaac had created a space unlike anything his neighbours had ever seen. The circular floor was about 12 feet across, enough room for a sleeping platform, a small table, storage for food and supplies, and most importantly, a central fire pit lined with stones. He had built a smoke hole at the apex of the dome, with a wooden chimney cap he could adjust with a pole to control the draft. The walls, covered with his clay plaster, were smooth to the touch and would reflect heat rather than absorb it. He had even carved small niches into the walls for candles and storage, making use of every bit of space. The ceiling height at the centre was maybe 8 feet, tall enough for him to stand comfortably, sloping down to perhaps 4 feet at the edges, where he had built the sleeping platform and storage shelves. It was snug, efficient, and completely foreign to everyone who saw it. October came, and Isaac moved into his dome. The nights were getting cold, frost appearing on the grass in the mornings, and he lit his first fire in the central pit. What he noticed immediately was remarkable. The fire, fed with just a few pieces of split pine, warmed the entire space within an hour. The curved walls seemed to hold and circulate the heat in a way that his old cabin never had, and the earth itself, both below his feet and surrounding the structure, acted like a massive heat sink, absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it slowly at night. Isaac slept through his first night without waking once to tend the fire, something that would have been impossible in Martin's cabin. When he emerged in the morning, his neighbours who happened to be passing asked mockingly how cold he had gotten. Isaac just smiled and said he had slept fine, thank you kindly. The skepticism continued through October and into November. The temperature kept dropping, snow began falling in earnest, and the conventional wisdom was that Isaac would come crawling to one of his neighbours, begging for a place to stay, once he realised his folly. Dutch Hendricks made a standing offer that Isaac could bunk with him, though he would charge a modest fee for the privilege. Martin Hayes, who still felt some responsibility for Isaac despite the embarrassment, checked in once a week to make sure he hadn't frozen to death. But Isaac kept reporting the same thing, that his shelter was comfortable, that he was using maybe a third of the firewood he had burned the previous winter, that he never woke up to frost on the inside of his walls. The others listened but didn't believe. They figured he was too proud to admit his mistake, that he was suffering in silence rather than face their told-you-so remarks. December arrived, and with it came the first real test. A storm rolled in from the west that buried Harrison Gulch in snow up to a man's waist. The temperature, which could be felt more than measured in those days, dropped to where breath froze in the air instantly, where metal tools left outside became too cold to touch with bare hands, where even inside the best-built cabins, men wore everything they owned and still shivered. Isaac's neighbors fed their fires constantly, burning through their carefully hoarded wood supplies, stuffing every crack in their walls with spare cloth, hanging blankets over windows and doors to keep out the drafts. Children cried from the cold. Women wrapped themselves in layers of wool, and men lay awake wondering if they would make it through the winter. Inside his dome, Isaac Coleman sat at his small table in shirt sleeves, reading by candlelight. He had a fire going, certainly, but it was a modest thing, a few pieces of wood burning steadily in his stone-ringed pit. The temperature inside his shelter felt comfortable, somewhere near what you might experience on a cool spring day back in Ohio. There was no draft, no cold spots, no desperate need to huddle close to the fire. The thick walls of clay and sod and earth, combined with the dome's shape that kept hot air from rising and escaping through the peak, created an environment that felt almost miraculous compared to what was happening in the cabins scattered throughout the gulch. Isaac knew his neighbors were suffering, but he also knew that they would never believe him unless they experienced it themselves. And he figured that day would come sooner or later. It came on a night in mid-January of 1880, when the cold intensified to a degree that old-timers would talk about for years afterward. The temperature dropped to what felt like the bottom of the world. Men woke to find that the water they had brought inside their cabins had frozen solid despite being near the fire. Horses in sheltered barns stood with ice forming on their nostrils. The very air seemed brittle and dangerous, and there was a real fear spreading through Harrison Gulch that people might not survive. Martin Hayes, whose cabin was reasonably well built by conventional standards, found himself in genuine trouble. His fire was consuming wood faster than he could feed it, and still the cold crept in through every crack and gap. His children, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, were bundled together under every blanket he owned, and they were still shaking. His wife looked at him with fear in her eyes, and Martin made a decision. Just after dawn, when the pale sun offered light but no warmth whatsoever, Martin Hayes wrapped himself in everything he owned and made his way through the snow to Isaac Coleman's dome. He had to admit that he was worried he would find Isaac dead, frozen in his foolish shelter, but he also held a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, Isaac had been telling the truth about how well his strange dwelling worked. Martin reached the low door, brushed aside the heavy hide curtain that served as Isaac's door in winter, and stepped down into the earth-sheltered space. What he felt was so profound and immediate that he actually stopped moving and just stood there, mouth open in disbelief. The interior of the dome was warm, not just less cold than outside, but genuinely warm, comfortable, the kind of warmth that made a man's bones stop aching and his muscles relax. Isaac was awake, tending his small fire, and he looked up as Martin entered. There was no gloating in Isaac's expression, just a quiet acknowledgement that his neighbor was suffering and needed help. Martin stood there for a long moment, feeling the warmth soak into his frozen body. looking around at the smooth clay walls that seemed to radiate heat, at the fire that was no bigger than what you might use for cooking, at Isaac sitting there calm and comfortable, while outside people were genuinely afraid for their lives. Martin Hayes, a proud man who had mocked Isaac's project for months, felt his eyes water, though whether from the warmth or from emotion he couldn't have said. He asked Isaac how it was possible. How could this work so well when his own cabin, built the way his father and grandfather had built cabins, was failing so completely? Isaac invited him to sit, poured him some coffee that was actually hot, and explained as best he could. He talked about how the earth itself was warm compared to the air in winter, how digging down meant wrapping the shelter in that stable temperature. He explained that the dome shape meant there was no straight path for heat to escape, that rising warm air was trapped and circulated rather than lost through a peaked roof. He described how the thick walls of layered clay, sod and stone acted like the walls of a root cellar, holding temperature steady regardless of what was happening outside. He mentioned that the smaller interior space meant less volume to heat, and that every surface, being curved and close, meant you felt the warmth from all directions, rather than just from one side, like you did sitting next to a fireplace in a rectangular cabin. Martin listened, and while he didn't understand all of it in technical terms, he understood the simple truth. Isaac had built something that worked better than anything else in the gulch, and he had done it by thinking different rather than just following tradition. Martin spent an hour in that dome, warming himself through, and when he finally left to return to his family, he did something he never thought he would do. He apologized to Isaac Coleman. He said he had been wrong, that he had let pride and tradition blind him to a better way, and that, if Isaac was willing, Martin would like to learn how to build a shelter like this for his own family. Isaac, who had endured months of mockery and isolation, simply nodded and said he would be happy to help come spring. Martin hurried back to his cabin, gathered his wife and children, and brought them all to Isaac's dome. They spent 3 days there, sleeping on the floor wrapped in their blankets, while outside the temperature stayed brutal, and during those days Isaac shared his food and his warmth without complaint or charge. Other miners, hearing about this, began to show up at Isaac's door, and he welcomed them all, though there was barely room for everyone. They crowded together in that earthen dome, marveling at the fact that a single small fire could keep them all comfortable, and they left converts to Isaac Coleman's way of thinking. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, something remarkable happened in Harrison Gulch. 3 miners, including Martin Hayes, approached Isaac about helping them build domes of their own. Isaac agreed, and through the summer of 1880 he worked with them, teaching them what he had learned through observation and experimentation. The process was labor-intensive and required patience, but by the time the first snows fell that next winter, there were 4 domes in Harrison Gulch instead of 1. Each of those families reported the same experience Isaac had: warm shelters that required far less firewood, no frozen water buckets in the morning, no desperate nights feeding fires every few hours. Word spread through the camps, and by the winter of 1881, more than a dozen families had built similar structures, each one adapted slightly to the builder's preferences, but all following the same basic principles that Isaac had pioneered. The technique became part of the local knowledge. When new miners arrived in Leadville, the old-timers would tell them about Coleman's domes, and more than a few of those newcomers chose to build that way rather than following convention. Isaac's original dome served him for more than 15 years, through winters that tested every structure in the high country, and it never failed him. The clay walls required some maintenance, patching cracks and reapplying plaster in spots where weather had eroded it, but the basic structure remained sound. When Isaac finally left Leadville in the mid-1890s, moving down to Denver to live with his daughter's family, he sold his property to a Swedish immigrant family who lived in that same dome for another decade. The structure eventually collapsed not from cold or snow, but simply from time and neglect, after it sat empty for several years following the Swedish family's departure. But by then, its legacy was secure. The knowledge of how to build earth-sheltered domes had spread throughout the Colorado mining camps, and variations of the design could be found from Leadville to Cripple Creek to the camps near Ouray. Some men made them smaller, some larger, some added stone entirely around the exterior. Some experimented with different roof angles, but they all traced their inspiration back to Isaac Coleman, and that first winter when he proved that thinking different from the crowd could mean the difference between suffering and comfort, between danger and safety. Looking back on Isaac's story, what stands out is not just the technical innovation, though that was significant, but the human courage it took to ignore the mockery and follow through on an idea that everyone else thought was foolish. Isaac saw a problem that was making people suffer, observed a potential solution, and had the determination to act on it despite social pressure to conform. He spent months of hard labor on something that might have failed spectacularly, that might have left him homeless and humiliated, but he trusted his own observations and reasoning more than he trusted conventional wisdom. That kind of independent thinking, combined with genuine skill and persistence, is what allowed frontier communities to adapt and survive in conditions that would have killed them otherwise. The story also reminds us that good ideas often look ridiculous until they are proven. Isaac's neighbors were not stupid or cruel. They were simply doing what humans do, trusting in methods that had worked for their ancestors and being skeptical of dramatic change. Their mockery came from genuine belief that Isaac was making a mistake, not from malice. But once the evidence was undeniable, once they felt the warmth of that dome on a night cold enough to kill, they were willing to admit error and adopt a better way. That capacity to change one's mind in the face of evidence, even at the cost of pride, is as important as the original innovation. For us today, Isaac Coleman's dome stands as a testament to the power of practical observation and the courage to experiment. These pioneers did not have engineering degrees or scientific instruments. They had eyes, hands, and minds willing to question assumptions. They solved impossible problems with whatever materials they could gather and whatever knowledge they could piece together through trial and observation. Every structure that kept a family alive through a deadly winter, every technique that made hard lives slightly easier, every innovation that spread from neighbor to neighbor until it became common knowledge, all of it came from individuals willing to think and act independently, to endure mockery and doubt, to trust in what they could see and build rather than what they had been told was the only way. If you find value in preserving these stories of frontier ingenuity, of men and women who survived and adapted through observation and courage rather than just tradition, then help us keep their memory alive. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss future accounts of how ordinary people solved extraordinary problems with nothing but determination and practical wisdom. Like this video to let others discover these narratives, and leave a comment sharing any stories you might know from your own family history about innovation or survival on the frontier. Every story preserved is a piece of human wisdom that might otherwise be lost. Every account shared is a connection to those who came before us and faced down impossible challenges with creativity and grit. These are not just tales of techniques and structures. They are stories of human resilience, of the capacity to observe and adapt, of the courage to be different when different means survival. Isaac Coleman built a dome in the mountains of Colorado when everyone said it could not work. And when the coldest night came, his neighbors learned that sometimes the fool is wiser than the crowd, and that true shelter comes not just from following plans, but from understanding principles, from seeing what others miss, from having the strength to act alone until others can see what you saw all along.